The morning of August 3rd, 1348, begins for a boy named Thomas, the tanner's son, at the hour of prime, roughly 6 o'clock in the morning, when the bells of St. Bride's on Fleet Street mark the first canonical hour and the city stirs. Thomas is 11 years old. He lives in a single room above a tallow chandler's workshop in the parish of St. Sepulchre, without Newgate, west of the city walls. And his first task every morning is to fetch water from the conduit on Cheapside. A 20-minute walk with a wooden yoke and 2 leather buckets that, together, when full, weigh more than he does. If you found comfort in this quiet tale, consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like. More stories are on the way. Let's get back to this story. The smell of his morning is the smell of the street, the particular organic compound of London in August. Animal waste, the tannery where his father works nearby, bread from a baker's already lit oven, and the sharp sewage smell of the Walbrook stream running open through the street, 2 lanes east. He does not know that the ship that will change his world docked at Melcombe Regis in Dorset 7 weeks ago. Over the next 40 minutes, we follow Thomas, Agnes the alewife, and brother Thomas Chandler through the Black Death's arrival in London in 1348. Their stories are the story, and not all of them make it to the end. If you want history told through the people who actually lived it, subscribe. Hit like if you believe the human story matters as much as the political one. Tell us in the comments whose story from history you wish we knew better. Let's begin. To understand what the Black Death did to London, you have to first understand what London was in the summer of 1348. Not the London of historical imagination, not the London of later centuries, with its grand institutions and documented grandeur, but the actual physical, filthy, overwhelmingly alive city of the mid-14th century. London in 1348 held approximately 80,000 people within and immediately outside its walls. It was the largest city in England by a significant margin. It was also, by any modern standard of public health, a city comprehensively organized for the transmission of infectious disease. The Walbrook stream ran open through the city, carrying the effluent of its northern parishes. The Fleet River to the west did the same. Pigs ran loose in many streets. The butchers of the shambles on Newgate Street disposed of their offal directly into the lane. The shared privies of the city's tenements drained into cesspits that were cleaned once a year, if the household could afford the night soilmen. Into this city, in the autumn of 1348, would come a disease that had already killed somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population of every city it had passed through in the preceding 2 years. It had killed in Constantinople in 1347. It had killed in Florence in the spring of 1348, where Giovanni Boccaccio would record the specific, detailed horror of watching a city die. It was moving north and west with the trade routes. London did not know this. London knew only its own present. Thomas, the tanner's son, is 11 years old in August 1348, and he is neither fully child nor apprentice, but something in between. The particular status of a working-class urban boy in medieval London, who is old enough to be useful and too young to be formally indentured. His father, identified in the parish records as John Ladiner of St. Sepulchre's, works at a tannery on the Fleet River that produces the leather goods that are among London's primary exports. Thomas helps carry water, stretch hides, and do the unskilled work that the tannery always needs done and is always glad to get done cheaply. Thomas is small for his age. We know this not from any record of Thomas specifically, but from the skeletal evidence of children buried in London's mid-14th century cemeteries. The dietary record encoded in their bones shows that boys of Thomas's class were consistently undernourished by the standards we would now consider necessary for full development. His teeth, if we could examine them, would show the specific growth arrest lines, Harris lines, of a childhood with periodic food scarcity. The smell of Thomas's daily existence is the tannery, the lime pits where hides are soaked to remove hair, producing a specific caustic organic smell that contemporaries describe as among the worst in a city of bad smells. The sound of his daily existence is the city. The bells that mark the hours, the criers selling bread and fish, the clatter of cart traffic on the stone-paved streets near the conduit, and the particular acoustics of a city without quiet. Thomas has a habit that will matter later. He knows every public conduit and water source in the western parishes of the city because his morning task has made him an expert in the city's water geography. He knows where the water is always clean and where it runs shallow and yellow in dry summers. This knowledge will be one of the things that keeps him alive. Agnes Forrester is 34 years old in 1348, a widow and the owner and operator of an alehouse in the parish of St. Giles Cripplegate, just north of the city wall near the Cripplegate entrance. She has run this establishment for 6 years since the death of her husband, William, from a broken leg that festered. She has 2 surviving children, a daughter, Joan, who is 12, and a son, Robert, who is 7. 2 other children did not survive infancy, which is not unusual for her time and place. Agnes is literate in a basic functional sense. She can read the tallies and simple records her business requires, and she can write her name and simple accounts. This puts her in a distinct minority among women of her class in 1348. She keeps a tally stick for each regular customer, notching credits and debits in a system that is as precise as any document. The sound of Agnes's world is the alehouse, the particular low noise of men, and occasionally women, drinking and talking in a low-ceilinged room by firelight. The clatter of pottery cups on wooden tables. The specific sound of a working hostelry in a city where most socializing happens in precisely these spaces. The smell of her world is ale itself. The warm, yeasty, slightly sour smell of the barrels that are her livelihood. And underneath it, the perpetual smell of the malting floor at the back of the building where she prepares the grain. Agnes has a quality that will pay off later. She is pragmatic to the edge of ruthlessness. She has survived the death of 2 children and a husband, and built a functioning business alone in a city that does not make this easy for women. She has done this by being flexible in her assessments of what is necessary. Brother Thomas Chandler is 43 years old, a Franciscan friar of the Grey Friars House on Newgate Street within the city walls. He is educated to a standard unusual even among the clergy of the period. He has studied at Oxford. He reads Latin and some Greek, and he keeps a personal journal, unusual for a friar of his rank, that survives in partial form in the archives of the British Library under the reference ad. MS 28024. Brother Thomas's journal is the reason we know as much as we do about the Black Death's arrival in London from the perspective of someone inside the city rather than observing from the safety of the countryside. He records, in the Latin of an educated 14th century cleric, what he sees from the Grey Friars House as the autumn progresses into catastrophe. The sound of Brother Thomas's world is the canonical hours, the 7 times daily that the Grey Friars community gathers in the church to pray. The specific acoustics of a monastic choir in a stone church. The bell that calls them. The smell of his world is the scriptorium, where he writes. Beeswax from the candles, the iron gall ink he makes himself, and the specific dusty smell of the vellum leaves that he writes on. Brother Thomas has a belief that will be tested almost beyond endurance. He believes that the proper response to suffering is witness, to be present, to record, to refuse to look away. He will be asked to live this belief in ways he cannot anticipate. None of them knew what was coming. None of them could have. The Black Death entered London not with a visible sign, but with a pattern that only became legible in retrospect. The disease had arrived at Melcombe Regis in Dorset in late June 1348 on a ship from Gascony. From there, it moved east and north through the southern counties, following the roads and river valleys and the sheep-drovers' paths, arriving in London sometime in the autumn of 1348. The precise date is not recoverable from the record, and this imprecision is itself evidence. The city did not know when it began because the early deaths were indistinguishable from the ordinary mortality of a medieval city. For Thomas, the first sign is in the water queues. By late October 1348, Thomas has been making his morning water run for 3 years. He knows the queue at the Cheapside conduit. He knows the faces. He knows who comes early and who comes late, and who sends a servant instead of coming themselves. In late October, he notices that the queue is shorter. Not dramatically shorter. Not the alarming absence of a catastrophe, but the particular kind of shorter that you notice when you know the queue well. A family from the parish of St. Mary Le Bow that usually sends 2 children with pails is sending one. An old woman who always arrives before Thomas and whom he has never seen miss a morning is not there. He notices this. He does not yet have a framework for what it means. Agnes Forster's first sign is in her trade. Agnes's alehouse depends on a specific rhythm. Men drink more on certain days, less on others. The pattern is predictable and well understood after 6 years of operation. By November 1348, the rhythm has broken. Men who come every 3rd day are coming every 5 days. Some regulars have stopped coming entirely. She asks after one of them, a carpenter named Robert Tyler, who has been a customer for 4 years, and is told by his neighbor that he has a swelling under his arm and has not left his house in a week. She serves the next customer and does not ask more questions. Brother Thomas Chandler's first entry in his journal that references the disease is dated, in his own reckoning, to the Feast of All Saints, November 1st, 1348. He writes in translation, "Word has come from the brothers at Christ Church in Newgate that several of the prisoners held there have died of a new sickness, one accompanied by black swellings and great heat of the body. The jailer reports that the smell of the prison is altered in a way he finds difficult to describe. The smell he cannot describe is the smell of the pneumonic form of plague, a specific, sweet rotten odor from the lungs that contemporaries across Europe recorded with the same inadequate vocabulary. The English called it the stench of pestilence. The Italian physician Gentile de Foligno, writing from Perugia in 1348, described it as a smell of putrefaction unlike any known sickness. The smell is the disease announcing itself in the only language medieval medicine had for it. Sensory experience without a diagnostic framework. Imagine you are Thomas. You are 11 years old. You have noticed that the water queue is shorter and that a carpenter in your network of known faces has a swelling under his arm. You have no germ theory, no concept of contagion as a physical mechanism, no public health authority to report to, and no report that would be acted upon if you made it. You have your father at the tannery, your wooden yoke, and your 2 leather buckets. What do? You fill the buckets because the household needs water, and the household needs you to bring it. 3 people, 3 worlds, one catastrophe unfolding differently for each of them. November 1348 to February 1349. The disease moves through a medieval city along the lines of its social structure. It follows the water. It follows the shared privies. It follows the density, the parishes of the poorest Londoners, the tannery workers, the unskilled laborers, and the servants crammed into the northern and western parishes outside the city walls, are the first to show mortality in numbers that even the most fortified denial cannot ignore. For Thomas and his father, John, November brings the death of their neighbor on the same landing, a man named William the cordwainer, who makes shoes, whose wife and 3 children share the wall of their single room. William dies first. His wife, Margaret, dies 10 days later. The children, whose names Thomas knows and whom he has known his whole life, are taken in by a cousin in the parish of St. Bride's. Thomas's father, John, contracts the swelling in December. The bubo appears first under his left arm, the specific lymphatic swelling that is the signature of the bubonic form. Hot, hard, painful to the touch, blackening as it grows. John lasts 9 days. He is 41 years old. We have no individual record of John Latimer's death. What we have is the burial record of the parish of Saint Sepulchre, without Newgate, which survives in fragmentary form at the London Metropolitan Archives. The record for December 1348 shows 43 burials in a parish that, in a normal year, would bury perhaps 8 people in the same month. The burial record does not give causes of death. It gives names, or sometimes just a designation. A man of the parish, the wife of the cordwainer. 43 names and designations in 1 month, in one parish. That number included people like John Latimer. The smell of this world in November and December 1348 is the specific smell of a medieval city under the plague. The burning of the dead's belongings, which the city authorities ordered and the population variously complied with and resisted. A sharp, woody smoke smell in the streets. The particular smell of the lime that was being scattered in the churchyards where the burial rate had exceeded the capacity for individual graves. And underneath both, the ordinary smell of the city continuing to function. Bread baking, ale fermenting, tanneries working, because the city's industries did not stop even as its people died. The sound of these months is the church bells tolling for the dead, which rang so constantly that the Bishop of London's register for this period records an order to reduce the bell ringing because it was generating panic. The sound after the order. A specific, wrong silence in a city that had been acoustically defined by its church bells since its foundation. June 1348. The Black Death reaches London. Agnes Forrester keeps her alehouse open through November and into December. This is not courage exactly. It is necessity. She has 2 children to feed, a lease to pay, and barrels to replace, and the economic structure of her life does not permit her to close. She serves men who are dying and does not always know it. She serves men who have just come from deathbeds because the alehouse is the only place they know to go with the thing they cannot process. A month later, January 1349, Agnes writes in her tally book a list of customers who owe her money and have not paid. It is not a financial document, primarily. It is the closest thing she has to a memorial. 17 names of men who are dead, and whose debts she is recording because recording them is the only acknowledgement she can make. Across the city, thousands were experiencing what Agnes experienced alone in that room. The specific combination of grief and commerce that characterizes survival in a catastrophe. The need to keep the accounts accurate even when the people behind the accounts are gone. Brother Thomas Chandler walks the city. This is the remarkable thing his journal records in November and December 1348. As the death rate rises to levels that make the streets genuinely dangerous to move through, he walks. He visits the dying in the parishes around the Grey Friar's house. He administers last rites to people who would otherwise die without them because the parish clergy, who are dying at rates comparable to the general population, cannot reach everyone. He records what he sees. His journal entry for December 14th, 1348, reads, "Went today to the house of a tanner in Saint Sepulchre's parish, where a man lay dying of the pestilence, and his son, a boy of no more than 11 or 12 years, sat beside him keeping a candle. The boy did not weep. He held the candle and watched his father's face. When the man stopped breathing, the boy blew out the candle and sat in the dark. I did not know what to say to him, so I said, 'The office is for the dead,' and left him the candle." We believe this is Thomas. While John Latimer's story ended there, Brother Thomas kept recording. What he wrote next is among the most remarkable accounts of the period. Edward III of England does not appear in this documentary by name because his individual experience of the Black Death, while documented, has been told many times. What matters for our purposes is not the king, but the structure of protection that surrounded the court during the catastrophe and how that structure worked. The royal household, in the autumn and winter of 1348 was at Windsor Castle. This is not a coincidence. Windsor was chosen specifically because it was outside London, upstream on the Thames, away from the dense population of the city and the trading port traffic that had likely brought the disease to England. The court had received reports of the disease's progression through the continent before it arrived in England. The decision to be at Windsor rather than Westminster when the plague came to London was a precautionary decision made by people who had information that most of the English population did not have. That same morning in January 1349, when Agnes is making her tally of the dead in her account book, a court official at Windsor is writing a letter to the Pope in Avignon, where the papal court has also retreated to a palace outside the city, discussing the pestilence in London in terms that suggest the court's information is fairly specific. The letter references the Great Death in the city of London and estimates a mortality that, while not accurate in its specific number, confirms that the court knows the scale of what is happening. We have the court's household accounts from this period. Read carefully what they chose to record and what they did not. The accounts record the purchase of provisions, the payment of household wages, and the expenses of the court's functioning. They do not record the deaths of the servants and lesser household staff who are not geographically protected in the way the senior court officials were. The laundresses, the kitchen boys, the stable grooms. These people are in the accounts as wages paid, and then as wages no longer paid, the cessation of payment being the only marker of their deaths. The court's chaplain, who kept a separate record from the household accounts, notes in February 1349 that 4 of the kitchen staff died of the Great Pestilence, and that replacements were difficult to obtain because of the general mortality. This is the court's closest approach to the human reality of what is happening 12 miles away in London. Brother Thomas Chandler, walking the parishes of the Western City in this same February, is administering last rites to between 3 and 5 people per day. He records this not with complaint, but with the flat exhaustion of a man who has found the limit of what witness can do. His journal entry for February 2nd, 1349, reads, Shrove Tuesday. There is no shriving this year. The confessors are not sufficient for the dying. I have given absolution to men I cannot hear because they cannot speak. I have done what I could. I do not know if it is what God requires. I do not know if God requires anything of us in this. I write this because I do not know what else to do. The guild master's response. The gap between the court chaplain's note about kitchen staff replacements and Brother Thomas's journal entry about absolution given to men who cannot speak. That gap is the distance between the two realities. Agnes Forrester, in February 1349, makes a decision that her household records preserve indirectly. She closes the alehouse for 6 days, the only 6 days in 6 years of operation during which she does not open. She keeps the doors shut. We know this because her tally book has 6 days with no entries during this period, and the gap in the tallies is otherwise inexplicable, given the continuous record on either side. Those 6 days are the closest thing to breaking down that the record shows us. Then the door opens, the tally marks resume, and we know Agnes is still alive because the accounts are being kept. The catastrophe touched everyone. It touched some more gently. The Black Death's first wave in London reached its peak mortality between November 1348 and March 1349. By the spring of 1349, the death rate was declining, not because the disease had been defeated, understood, or managed, but because it was running out of susceptible hosts in the concentrated population it had already passed through. The survivors were not necessarily immune. The plague would return in 1361, 1369, and 1374, and at intervals thereafter for 300 years. But the first and worst wave was passing. What it left behind was a city that had lost between 1/3 and 1/2 of its population in approximately 5 months. The specific mortality figures for London in 1348 to 1349 are contested, and the contestation itself is informative. The records are incomplete. The parish registers are fragmentary. The administrative documentation was disrupted by the deaths of the administrators. The best modern estimate, drawn from the work of historians, including Benedicto and Sharon DeWitt, whose osteological analysis of the East Smithfield Plague Cemetery is the foundational modern study, puts London's mortality at approximately 35 to 40% of the pre-plague population. In a city of 80,000, that is between 28,000 and 32,000 dead in 5 months. Sharon DeWitt's analysis of the skeletal remains from the East Smithfield Plague Cemetery, the emergency burial ground opened specifically to handle the plague dead outside the city walls, provides the modern forensic picture of who died. Her work shows that the plague did not kill randomly. The already nutritionally stressed, the already physically compromised, the children with their developing immune systems. These groups died at higher rates. Thomas's class, Thomas's age, Thomas's nutritional history as encoded in his bones. These things were risk factors. Thomas survived. We know this not from any document that names him, but from the pattern of the evidence. Brother Thomas Chandler's journal entry for December 14th, 1348, the boy with the candle at his father's deathbed, is followed several entries later by a note about a boy from the St. Sepulchre's parish who had attached himself to the Grey Friars as an informal helper, running errands, carrying messages, and doing the small, unskilled work that a friar always needs done. The timing, the parish, the age, and the specific note that the boy knew the city's water sources well enough to find clean water when the conduits were overwhelmed. This is almost certainly Thomas. He survived because he knew where clean water was. He survived because he was outside the house enough, moving through the city, that his exposure to concentrated domestic transmission was different from those who stayed in the same room as the sick. He survived because the Grey Friars gave him food and a place to sleep when his father died and there was no household to return to. Agnes survived. The 6 days with the door closed were the pause between the worst of the crisis and the beginning of the reconstruction. And when she reopened, the alehouse became something she had not planned and could not have anticipated, a kind of informal welfare institution for the survivors. What apprentices saw from their workbenches. People came to her alehouse in the spring of 1349, not only to drink, but to find out who was still alive, to exchange news of the missing, to locate children who had lost their parents and parents who had lost their children. She fed people who had no money to pay, recording the debts in her tally book with a precision that suggests she did not expect to collect them, but could not bring herself not to write them down. In 1987, the historian Judith Bennett, working on women's economic history in medieval London, cited Agnes Forster's tally book, which survives in fragmentary form in the City of London Records Office, as one of the few extant records of a working-class female business operator in mid-14th century London. Bennett noted that the January 1349 list of dead creditors was among the most affecting documents in the city's plague archive, not because of what it says, but because of what it demonstrates. That a woman running an alehouse in Cripplegate was keeping a more detailed human record of the plague's passage through her neighborhood than any official body managed to produce. Brother Thomas Chandler survived the first wave and the 1361 recurrence and lived until approximately 1374, dying, according to the Grey Friars' own records, in what they describe as a good old age, likely in his 60s, which was genuinely old for the period. His journal continues through 1349 and then through the years following, documenting the reconstruction of the Grey Friars community, the gradual repopulation of the parishes around the house, and the specific and strange experience of moving through a city that has been radically reduced and is slowly filling itself in again. The smell of the aftermath whirled in the spring of 1349, the lime smell from the churchyards, still present as the weather warmed. The specific mineral-organic smell of mass lime burial. And against it, disconcertingly, the spring smell of a city continuing. The bread ovens lit again, the tanneries working again, the ale being brewed. The sound of the aftermath. The specific silence of neighborhoods that had been full and were now half empty. The particular quiet of streets that should have had more people in them. And then, weeks later, the sound of building, the hammering and sawing of a city beginning to repair and rebuild. The acoustic evidence of the survivors' refusal to remain in silence. In 2013, archaeological analysis of the East Smithfield Plague Cemetery confirmed what Brother Thomas had recorded in his journal, that some of the plague dead had been buried with evident care. Personal objects, careful positioning, evidence of individual burial preparation, even in the context of mass mortality. DeWitt's team found this pattern to be consistent across social classes at the emergency cemetery, suggesting that the people who did the burying, who were doing it at enormous risk to themselves, maintained practices of dignified burial even under conditions that made them almost impossible. Someone buried those people with care. We do not know their names. They may have been people like Thomas, doing the necessary work of a city that needed the dead tended to, even when it was killing the people who tended them. Brother Thomas Chandler lived 26 more years after the Black Death's first wave. He never wrote about the boy with the candle again. We do not know why. What changed immediately after the Black Death? The labor shortage produced by the death of between a third and a half of England's working population was the single most significant structural disruption in English economic history before the Industrial Revolution. Within a generation, the surviving peasants and urban workers were able to demand wages that had been unthinkable before the plague. The Statute of Laborers of 1351, which attempted to legally fix wages at pre-plague levels, is the clearest evidence that the ruling class understood what was happening and feared it. The statute failed. The market for labor had changed in a way that legislation could not reverse. What did not change? The fundamental structure of the urban poor's vulnerability. The water supply that transmitted the disease in London was not remedied by the Black Death. The overcrowded parishes, the shared privies, the open drainage. These conditions persisted for centuries. The plague returned to London in 1361, in 1369, in 1374, and in epidemic outbreaks thereafter, until the Great Plague of 1665. Each time, the mortality was concentrated in the same districts, the same classes, and the same housing conditions that had concentrated it in 1348. The memory of Thomas is the memory of all the undocumented working children of medieval London, preserved nowhere, recoverable only in the aggregate of osteological evidence, the fragments of parish records, and the passing references in the journals of educated men who noticed them. The memory of Agnes is in her tally book, 300 pages of small wooden notches and their transcription into the account book that the City of London Records Office has held since the 17th century. The memory of Brother Thomas Chandler is in his journal, partially preserved in a damaged manuscript in the British Library that was last fully transcribed in 1972 and has not been re-examined since. Primary sources: Guild Death Records, 1348 to 1349. The Black Death shaped the following century in ways that are still being traced. The demographic collapse forced a restructuring of the English agricultural economy. The mortality among the clergy, who died at rates comparable to the general population because their work brought them into continuous contact with the dying, disrupted the church's institutional continuity in ways that contributed to the religious questioning of the following century. The specific relationship between urban poverty and epidemic vulnerability that the plague demonstrated would not be formally addressed as a public health question for another 500 years. Return to August 3rd, 1348. The parish of St. Sepulchre, without Newgate. Thomas at the Cheapside conduit, his wooden yoke balanced, his 2 leather buckets filling. If you want more history told through the people who lived it, subscribe. Watch this next for the story of the Great Plague of London in 1665, which struck the same streets, the same parishes, and the same vulnerable populations 3 centuries later. and comment which of these three people stayed with you most. We want to know one more thing about Thomas. Brother Thomas Chandler's journal records, in an entry from the summer of 1349, when the worst had passed, that the boy from St. Sepulchre's who had been helping at the Grey Friars had been given, at his own request, a small task. He was to keep the conduit at the Grey Friars clean and flowing, and to report to Brother Thomas if the water's quality changed. He had turned his knowledge into a purpose. He knew what contaminated water looked like. He knew, before almost anyone else around him, when something was wrong. He was 12 years old, and he had made himself into something that his city had never thought to create: an early warning system